Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. The mystical radio station. In a small, abandoned town in the eastern United States stood an old radio station, long forgotten and neglected. It had its own history, a history that no one dared to speak of, but those who remembered the past cautiously avoided it. Although the building had stood empty for many years, its eerie aura emitted something incomprehensible and terrifying at night. On the outside, the radio station looked ordinary, dilapidated with dark, perpetually damp walls that seemed heavy, as though the building itself was hiding from the light. The windows were boarded up, and the entrance had long rusted, yet nothing could stop the strange sound that occasionally erupted from within. Only the bravest of souls ventured here at night, seeking to learn about the old legends, which had by then become little more than whispers in the dark. The radio station had not only a physical existence but also a dark history. During World War II, scientists worked there on experiments related to radio waves and the mental states of people. These were cruel experiments designed to study the effect of radio waves on the human mind and consciousness, but the results of these trials had nothing to do with science. Now, it all seemed like a distant, sorrowful memory. But one night, something changed. People began to notice that strange signals were increasingly emanating from the radio. Static, screams, but most frighteningly, voices. Voices that seemed to come from another world. What happened next was terrifying and incomprehensible. Anyone who tried to listen to these signals heard more and more sounds that seemed impossible to exist in the real world. They were heard not only through the radio but also in the ears of people far from the station. These were rumors of horrifying experiments conducted in the radio station's basement at a time when no one had yet refused to work. The victims didn't disappear, their souls remained in the airwaves, and now, when old recordings were accidentally restored, these souls began to demand their freedom. Eventually, one of the local girls, Laura, became intrigued by these stories and decided she couldn't leave it without investigating. She was courageous, always eager to unravel the mysteries surrounding the town. So, she set off to the old radio station to understand what was happening. She left a note for her brother. "I'll find out what happened. I'm not afraid." Laura reached the entrance to the station and saw that the doors, which had been shut for many years, were now slightly ajar. She stepped over the threshold and immediately felt her heart race. All her senses seemed to become heightened. It felt as though someone was watching her closely. The silence around her was almost oppressive, as if something were about to shatter the tension. Inside the station, everything was covered in dust, but somewhere in the far background, a shadow could be seen. Laura began descending into the basement. Each of her steps echoed loudly in the emptiness. And then she heard it, a whisper. At first, it was barely audible, but with each passing minute, it grew louder and clearer. She began to hear words spoken in incomprehensible languages that made her skin crawl with cold sweat. "They're still here," the voice echoed off the walls, as if speaking directly to her. Sadness and fear overwhelmed Laura. But she didn't stop. She pressed on. The sense of impending terror grew stronger. Finally, when she reached the old radio equipment, connected to a vast system covering the walls, there was a sudden flash of light. And from its loudspeaker came a voice that sounded eerily familiar. "Laura, you've finally come." It was the voice of her mother, but altered, distorted, unlike anything she remembered. Laura began to tremble. She realized that something horrible existed within these walls, and that her mother had become one of the victims of these experiments. Signals from another world, reflected waves, prearranged for transmission into reality, were capturing more and more people. The souls that entered this airwave could not find peace. They remained there, in the radio station, and that was their only way back. With each step, Laura felt her mind slipping back into the abyss from which there would be no return. And in just a few minutes, as her voice mingled with those from the other world, her body began to petrify in terror. Now she was part of the airwaves. She could never go back. What had once been a radio station was now a window between worlds, and anyone who tried to learn more would only become another part of this nightmare cycle that would never end. The night grew even darker as Laura found herself at the heart of this dreadful place. Her body felt like stone, as though the very ground beneath the radio station was absorbing her strength, her consciousness. The voices continued to emanate from the loudspeaker, no longer resembling human voices. Now, they were merely sounds from the depths of another world where there were no laws of time or space. Her thoughts began to blur, and every attempt to understand what was happening only intensified her fear. Every time she tried to reach the doors, they vanished again and again. It was as if the walls of the station were playing with her, preventing her escape. With every step she took, new images began to appear around her. Black shadows emerged from the empty corners, slithering toward her like mercury-like wrinkles. Laura tried not to look into their eyes, for as soon as she did, her mind would slowly start to crumble, and she could hear voices in her head attempting to unbalance her. Her heart beat even faster when, in one of the dark corners, she saw a silhouette. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. But as she drew closer, the silhouette became clear. It was a woman whose gaze reflected nothing but emptiness. You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her voice was distorted, barely audible, but there was something heavy in it, like the grinding of metal. Laura recoiled, trying to retreat, but her legs refused to obey. The woman's shadow drew closer, and with it, her face began to distort. Her eyes widened, growing larger and larger until they became two dark empty pits that consumed the world around them. She reached out her hand, and a rusty metal ring appeared in her palm. It was a remnant of one of those sinister experiments carried out here. Laura closed her eyes, trying to push the vision away, and immediately, she felt her body filled with an unbearable cold. Her hands began to lose sensation, and then, like in a bad dream, she felt her palms slowly enveloped in black air so thick it had its own scent, the smell of burnt flesh. Her mind started to shut down, and the fear in her soul reached its peak. Laura knew that with every second, she was getting closer to the moment when she would become part of these horrific experiments. She saw a face before her, which at first seemed familiar. It was her mother, but with eyes filled only with darkness. You will become like me," her mother whispered, and her lips slowly twisted into a smile that instantly morphed into something demonic. Every sound in the airwaves was no longer just a sound. They were moans, screams, and torment that grew closer and closer until they filled the entire space of the radio station. Laura could not escape, could not move. All she could do was listen as the horrifying choir grew louder and closer. And then, as her eyes briefly opened, she saw new figures beginning to emerge from the corners of the room. People, or what seemed to be people, stood in the darkness, their faces covered in wounds, cut down to the bone, with vacant stares that remained empty, lifeless. They did not move, but their eyes, their gazes, clearly felt like they were staring directly at her. Laura managed only one step back when suddenly one of the figures reached out its hand to her. She couldn't do anything but stand there, watching as the hand approached. And then something happened that made her fall to her knees in terror. Before her, a huge portal opened. A dark, terrifying abyss that consumed everything around it. And from this abyss began to spill endless streams of dreams and nightmares, twisting into a single mass, draining Laura of all her will. And then, she saw it. The woman's body began to change again, stretching into a monster, and within moments, her hands and legs transformed into incredibly cold iron chains that quickly bound Laura to the walls of the radio station. With each step, she grew closer to the shadow that was stealing her mind and life. "Now you will be with us too," echoed in her mind, and Laura realized that it was no longer her soul, but just another part of this terrifying cycle that would never end. The fear that overwhelmed Laura became unbearably heavy. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if she had entered another reality, where time didn't exist and there was no place for peace. It seemed as though the radio station itself was alive, its walls breathing, absorbing everything around it. Everything that entered its boundaries became part of its horrific universe. Laura's hands, shackled in cold metal chains, began to gradually freeze, and every touch of the chains against her skin felt like her body was being torn apart. Voices began to echo in her head again. Voices of the victims of past experiments who had been here before her, voices speaking from that terrible world between worlds. "You will not escape. All who come here stay forever. They become part of this place," one of the voices said. Its tone was hopeless, filled with longing for those who had already become part of the radio station. Laura closed her eyes, trying to find at least a moment of peace, just one moment to understand how she could free herself. And in that instant, Her mother's face appeared again. It was not the same face she remembered. It radiated no warmth. Instead, it was a cold, merciless mask. Her mother stared silently, then her mouth slowly opened, and an inaudible whisper escaped. "You were so dear to me. You must leave this place, or you will become part of us." Laura couldn't understand what this meant. She felt the cold begin to penetrate deeper into her body, her consciousness, her soul. She found herself in a labyrinth of darkness, where everything had blended. Past, present, and future had become one. Laura could no longer tell if she was alive or if she was simply a dream that would never end. "This broadcast absorbs everything," her mother's voice said, now no longer resembling a human sound. It was something more, something beyond comprehension. Laura tried to remember how she had gotten here. Her memory was torn into pieces, just like her body, which no longer seemed hers. All the hours she had spent in the radio station felt like an entire life that had never been hers. She remembered her brother, and her heart beat faster. It was hard for her to believe that he was still alive, that he hadn't come here yet. But then her gaze shifted again. The shadows around her began to move, and she saw one of them step out of the darkness and approach her. It was a man, his face horribly distorted, but there was something human in his eyes. "Choose, Laura," the man said, his voice deep and heavy. "Stay here forever and become part of this place, or try to escape and pay for it with your soul." Laura asked herself if it was truly possible to choose. Her mind had already been lost, and these voices, these shadows, wouldn't let her rest. She was already imprisoned in this world, a part of this beautiful but terrifying reality. But suddenly, she remembered one moment, one fragment of her memory. When she was little, her mother had promised her that she would always protect her from the darkness. And Laura couldn't break that promise. She took a deep breath, gathering the last of her strength. A thought echoed in her head. "I cannot stay in this place. I cannot become part of this nightmare." And with that thought, she screamed, as though that scream was the only way to break this reality, to return. The world around her cracked open, fissures appeared, and the radio station began to tremble. Its walls began to twist, as if the building itself was trying to break her will. But not so quickly. Fear continued to fill her soul, and it already seemed like her body no longer existed. Suddenly, Laura saw the darkness again. This time, she was not alone. Somewhere behind her, footsteps sounded, familiar, yet not human. They grew closer, and the voices awoke again. The shadows moved, growing in number. And now Laura knew it was not just her imagination. She was not alone. And when the darkness surrounded her, she realized that in order to escape, she would have to walk this path with them. "We're together again," the voices said in her head. And Laura understood that she would never return home. Now, she was part of the station, part of the abyss, where everyone who entered stayed forever. The mystical radio station had claimed yet another soul. And when the voices on the airwaves drowned out everything around her, Laura understood. This broadcast had no end. She had become part of it, and this world would be eternally alive, terrifying, and irreversible for her. The darkness around Laura grew increasingly oppressive, like an invisible enemy squeezing her from all sides. She could no longer distinguish where reality ended and something else began. Her sense of time blurred, and the only thing that remained was the terrifying presence of the radio station, which no longer seemed just like a building but the very essence of evil. The entire space around Laura was absorbing light, and she realized that it wasn't just physical darkness, but also mental, the loss of control over herself, over her thoughts. The voices that echoed on the airwaves were no longer just sounds. They were the echoes of souls that had become part of this bitter reality. Every sound, every step. It was a passage into another dimension, a world where simple truths did not exist, where there was no place for peace or rest. "You won't leave here," the voices whispered from all directions. They grew closer, so close that Laura felt them penetrate her mind, mixing with her thoughts. Her body became heavy, its joints tearing apart, and her soul sank deeper into the abyss of this horrific world. Her eyes closed, but images still appeared before her. She saw the walls of the radio station moving, as if they had come to life. The ceiling began to crack, and black stains appeared in it, rapidly spreading. These stains stretched downward, turning into something resembling webs, but these webs were not ordinary. They were made from shadows, from the very souls that had once filled this place. Suddenly, her body began to move. It was unnatural. She no longer controlled her movements. Laura slowly rose to her feet, and although her consciousness was almost lost, something inside her was still fighting, something that refused to accept that she would stay here forever. "You're back on air," a voice from the radio she hadn't noticed before sounded. The voice was cold, dead, with no emotional tone. "You are one of us now. You will be with us forever." Laura felt the message fill her mind. She tried to scream, but her voice choked in her throat. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even think clearly. Her body moved on its own, walking wherever these terrifying signals led her. And then, suddenly, the woman appeared before her again. The same figure she had seen before. She stood amidst the shadows, black liquid dripping from her face, which resembled blood but moved like a living being. Her eyes grew larger, taking on an incomprehensible depth, and then everything changed. The image of Laura's mother appeared before her again, but now she was completely different. This was no longer her mother. It was just a mask that remained from the one who had once lived. She smiled, and the smile was ruthless, empty. "Laura, you are now part of us, part of this world. You cannot leave. You no longer exist. You are just an echo of what once was." Her mother's voice was now hollow, and it seemed that fear itself was flowing from it. And then the radio station stirred, like a fire burning in its core. All the walls began to disappear, and Laura found herself in a space with no boundaries. It was infinity, but it was filled with pain and torment, and everything that happened here was like an endless cyclical process of suffering. She felt herself being consumed by this space, her mind and body becoming part of what lay beyond human understanding. All these voices, these souls, these images, they had become her new reality. She was no longer Laura, nor even human. She was just an illusion, no longer entitled to freedom. And then Laura realized that this place was not just a radio station, it was a doorway to another world, dark and invisible, where everyone who crossed its threshold stayed forever. Now, this place had become her eternal home. With each passing day, this place claimed more souls, and although their bodies disappeared from the world's surface, their souls remained here, in the dark corridors of the radio station. And that was the only thing that remained, the endless broadcast that would never end. And when the next fatal signal echoes on air, someone new will find this place. And perhaps someone else will become part of this world of horror, this boundless nightmare that has no end. Laura felt her consciousness gradually fade, and all her thoughts scattered into the darkness that consumed her. She was no longer sure where her beginning and end were, as her body had become something foreign, detached from who she once was. Her soul no longer belonged to her. It was just a part of this place, part of the endless cycle where each new arrival became the next link in the chain of pain. The darkness around her consumed more and more, and the world of the radio station blurred and began to look like something abstract, non-existent, formless. All sounds merged into one dull noise, and Laura realized that this world had no boundaries. She had entered a place where time did not exist, and where there was no way out. "You will never leave. This is your place, your eternal existence." These words echoed in her mind, like the reverberation of voices that would never stop sounding. They became part of her, and now she was just another shadow wandering in the darkness. Her body, once alive, began to decay. It was no longer a body, but only a shell that carried the painful memory of who she once was. All her senses slowly faded away. She no longer felt cold, pain, or fear. Everything became endless, constant, and indifferent. And at that moment, the woman appeared before her again, the one who had been her first encounter with this nightmare. She stood in the darkness, her eyes growing wider, and once more she extended her cold, merciless hands toward Laura. "You belong to us," she said, her voice like wind penetrating to the core. "You have already become part of us. And like us, you will be immortal in this place." And at that last moment, Laura realized, her body and soul no longer belonged to her. They had become part of this radio station, part of the endless circle of suffering, where all those who entered could never escape. Her eyes closed, and everything around her turned into endless darkness, into which she could no longer fall, for she had become part of this darkness. Her voice vanished into the collective chorus of tormented souls that would never find peace. The radio station continued to function. And every time its signals pierced the silence, someone else found this cursed space. And someone new became part of these horrors. And it would always be this way, as long as these voices echoed in the air, until the world was left with nothing but this endless cycle, this radio station that takes souls and never releases them. And every new voice that hears the signal comes here, into the darkness, where there is no exit. They become new parts of this terrifying story, and everything repeats. Each of them is one link in this endless chain of horror. And so it will always be. Velopsu, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.